Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is Sunday, December 7th, 2025. My name is Jeffrey Ford, and this is my introductory video. First time on Patreon, so we'll see how this goes. I've had some YouTube streaming in the past, and this topic is Gulf War veterans' illnesses. Now, there's a lot of streamers, there's a lot of stuff out there from and surrounding events in 1991, namely the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, also known as the Persian Gulf War. Now let's make a clear distinction. We're not talking about the invasion of Iraq in the 2000s post 9/11, when the question of weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, was in the forefront. In 1991, following his 8-year war with Iran, Saddam had a very well-established program of weapons of mass destruction. He had ample amount of biological and chemical weapons produced and in production and weaponized at the time that he invaded Kuwait in 1990. There was no question about his capabilities at that time, and our mission was not necessarily to go in and destroy his weapons manufacturing capabilities, although that became focus following the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War was different from Operation Iraqi Freedom in the 2000s in that it was fully sanctioned and directed by the United Nations with specific resolutions insofar as how the war was conducted, the war's mission, and to what degree that war was prosecuted. The mission was to remove him by any means from the nation of Kuwait. Anything past that is and will always be subject of controversy. That was the mission that we were given. Personally, I served with the 307th Engineer Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was assigned to HHC, which was the headquarters company of the battalion, and I had several duties within that assignment, but when it came time for the ground war to begin, I assumed my duty as a combat engineer and took over my role in the assault and barrier platoon, which was to drive a 5-ton dump truck with 800 landmines and a mine clearing line charge to spearhead the invasion of the far west flank of the coalition ground movement. Without going into a lot of detail at this point in time, I ended up at Khamisiyah. Khamisiyah was a massive weapons depot facility, storage warehouses, metal warehouses, and bunkers that Saddam used in the Iran-Iraq War and the invasion of Kuwait. We're talking about 150 bunkers and warehouses with somewhere near 56 kilotons worth of ordnance, which is the equivalent of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. We were tasked with destroying that facility following the ground war, which began on the destruction of Khamisiyah began in wholesale on March 4th, 1991. We were there for several weeks, and there was some units, the 11th Cav, who followed on and did some follow-on demolitions after us. This is notable because it was on March 4th, 1991, that 33 bunkers were initiated, one of which has now become known as Bunker 73, contained upwards of 1,500 122 millimeter Russian rockets tipped with sarin, cyclosarin, about 45 days fresh out of the factory. By UNSCOM approximation, which is the UN inspection team, and CIA modeling, put their agent purity at about 50%. Still, for those familiar with sarin, it takes about the equivalent of one pin drop on your skin to kill you in a matter of seconds. So whether it's 70%, 50% lethality, it doesn't take much. Sarin, or nerve agent, is essentially bug spray Raid for humans. It is manufactured to a degree that is no different than spraying a cockroach. Same compound, just instead of an insecticide, it is a homicide. My experience, I was there the entire operation. I hauled the demolition supplies, the C4, the dead cord, the blasting caps, everything in order to blow these bunkers and warehouses, including the pit area where some of the rockets had been moved by the Iraqi Chemical Corps because they had begun to leak. And I was there from March 4th until our departure on March 17th. So I was there about 13 days. So I have direct experience with the entire operation. And in 1996, when I saw a 60 Minutes interview with the 37th Engineers, who was tasked under us and worked with us, they had a videotape that they had taken, and they were on 60 Minutes describing illnesses and their experience there at Khamisiyah. The next day, I contacted the White House, and the next week, I was testifying before the Presidential Advisory Committee and was appointed the Executive Director of the world's largest Gulf War Veterans organization at the time, and appeared on the front page of the New York Times, eventually Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, Mary Matlin radio show, and testified before House Veterans Affairs Committee 3 times on Gulf War veterans' illnesses. And I drafted, along with the legislative director at the time of the Vietnam Veterans of America, who had written and passed the Agent Orange legislation the year before, William Russo, who has sadly and since consequently passed away in 2014, I believe. That legislation became the Persian Gulf Veterans Health Act of 1998, also known as the Undiagnosed Illnesses legislation, which was then adapted and to incorporate burn pits and Camp Lejeune, and eventually expanded to cover a multitude of environmental exposures that is now known as the PACT Act. Before this time, there was no legislation that, aside from the Agent Orange legislation, that dealt with chemical exposures, and nothing that incorporated something as complex and difficult to diagnose as Gulf War veterans' illnesses. As I told Congress when they asked what I thought was making veterans sick, I don't know. There has been 30 years of research now. I'm a little more leaning towards the direction that I do believe I know what caused the illness in some veterans. But unlike Agent Orange, Gulf War veterans' illnesses is what I liken to Agent Rainbow. It's a multitude of exposures and genetic predisposition, and basically what happens when you take 700,000 people and put them in a very toxic environment, all with different experiences, different exposures, and different vulnerabilities. You don't get one Gulf War syndrome, and that is what has been the difficulty in understanding, both from the clinical and professional side, in trying to treat and compensate Gulf War veterans, but also the understanding of Gulf War veterans in that it has long been recognized by the VA and the Department of Defense that Gulf War veterans are ill to a degree and in ways that far exceed the normal population. Is there one single cause, one single diagnosis available? No. Now, with that said, recently there has been a diagnostic code assigned and recognized for Gulf War veteran illnesses. We'll be discussing that, and along with many other things that went into that code. And I'm going to forego any more detail on that for the moment because there's a whole lot I want to cover here. I've been researching this for over 30 years now. Much of what we know has come to us through investigations by the Department of Defense and the CIA in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. They controlled the narrative. They controlled the documentation. But at the time, at least, we had some momentum, we had some organization, and we had some power. That has since waned. And unfortunately, the misinformation that pervades and has always surrounded Gulf War veterans issues continues to pervade. What I'm seeing a lot of is in social media a lot of fake accounts of so-called veterans that I believe are orchestrated by entities outside the United States to continue to convolute and cause dissent amongst veterans. Much to our detriment, because where there's misinformation, there's also blame, and misplaced blame. Now, there's plenty of blame to go around, and I assure you that if you follow this blog, YouTube channel, what have you, over the coming months, I'm going to assign plenty of blame. With that said, let's see if we can move on to a little more detail about what we're going to be talking about. And I'm not really sure how to go about beginning to encompass this massive topic. Let's start with some pictures. Bunker 73 was the bunker within the complex that contained originally about 2,160 rockets. That is what Iraq claimed and disclosed to the UN inspection teams in 1991 as part of the United Nations effort to dismantle Saddam's chemical and biological weapons program. Insofar as we know, he did not have any nuclear capabilities, and insofar as I know, there's never been any evidence that he was trying. With that said, who knows? That's not my expertise. My expertise is specifically in the chemical weapons stored at Khamisiyah. You can see here, let's see. Here we have a photo of some crates within the bunker complex. What's important in this picture, not so much as the crates, but the wall construction is made up of locally sourced brick and mortar with a concrete floor. Here's a photo, and I'm kind of cropping this person's face because I haven't blacked that out yet. Is priming a charge. We had a very disparage amount of C4. They were not able to fly it in fast enough, so we had to use field expedient methods, wrapping it around warheads and displacing it in different crates, just try to get some sympathetic detonation. In other words, it's like putting a firecracker on a 5-gallon can of gasoline to get it to go off. Here's a view of one of the bunkers, and I know this is not zoomed in. Today was a little informal. In the future, we'll have slideshows and whatnot. This is the morning of March 4th, as these bunkers were being primed. Here's another photo of the interior. Notice the columns, concrete, rebar reinforced with crates stacked pretty high within the bunker. A lot of these munitions were old. They had been here for a long time. Here's another photo. This is actually the next day after it had rained, and it just gives you an idea of how far away these bunkers were from each other. This is the actual March 4th destruction. This is probably 30 to 40 minutes after the initial explosion. This is taken from the canal where the 37th and the 307th engineers had assembled. In the forefront, there's a picture of it. You can see an American flag, which is giving us some wind direction. And that is blowing at about 10 knots to the northwest. Here's some important photos. This is from a CBS Evening News interview from February of 1997, where some footage was provided through the UN inspection teams when they came through months later to try to excavate some of these remnants of the rockets that were still in the bunker. The CIA and the Department of Defense had claimed that Bunker 73 was completely destroyed. It was not. And a number of the rockets, such as this one here, were split open. And this was not from heat. This was from collision, from numbers of rockets being blown apart and knocked around within the bunker. You can see this is the white within the case, within the shell casing is a liner that held the agent, and the UN inspection team actually drilled into some intact rockets and did in fact verify that these rockets had, and still did in some cases, hold up to 8 kilograms of sarin, cyclosarin, which was a mix. It's a pretty sophisticated mechanism. Iraq had modified these rockets. They were Russian design and I believe Egyptian manufactured 122 millimeter multiple launch rocket system. They had manufactured their own warheads because the Russian / Syrian, Egyptian models were not chemical. They were high explosive in nature. So the chemical component for the Iraqi rockets were manufactured by Iraqis. So this photo here, I'm going to actually blow up because it is important. And looks like I blew it up completely. Oh well, we'll find it again. There we go. Well, let's just, as you can see here, there is an American flag being flown on this dump truck. This is what the CIA used as their reason for not modeling or considering this day in Bunker 73 as a potential exposure. Because in looking at this, let's see if I can grab a screenshot here. At first glance, looking at this photo, and if you were to ask yourself or anyone else, what direction is the flag blowing? A normal person would say it's blowing from right to left. And technically speaking, that is the direction that the flag is blowing, which would put the winds blowing to the northeast, away from any coalition troops. That is the premise by which the next 30 years history was changed, because on March 4th was Bunker 73. On March 10th, we blew the open pit area where some of the rockets from Bunker 73 had been moved by the Iraqis prior to the invasion and capture by U.S. forces. The consequence being, if you were also to then again ask in this photograph, which way is the wind blowing? Not the flag. Which way is the wind blowing? Now if you imagine a sheet on a clothesline or a sail on a boat, which direction does the flag indicate that the wind is blowing? And that answer would be in the direction of the view of the camera towards the plume. In other words, the flag is billowing full of air in the direction that everyone is looking, not the direction that the flag is pointing. Two different things completely. But by that simple obfuscation, and I'll use that term quite a lot, the CIA was able to say, we're not going to even look at Bunker 73 as a potential exposure to U.S. troops, because the wind was blowing away from the U.S. troops and the bunker was completely destroyed, which we know that it wasn't. And we know that which was sorry, just having a little bit of stream drop. What we'll be doing is what I have done over the last year specifically is, not only do I have a bachelor's degree in physical and environmental geography and have now completed coursework for the master's degree, is I will show as I recreate the March 4th event. Basically, the CIA and the Department of Defense said they didn't have the meteorological data, they didn't have sufficient, they had a number of reasons for not modeling the March 4th event. The main reason is this, ladies and gentlemen. The time span between March 4th and March 10th, the pit event that they did model or tried to, as many as 40,000 or more troops retrograded back into Saudi Arabia. or left the area completely. That's 40,000 less. Now I'm not sure, I'm seeing some irregularities in my stream here, so I'm going to end this and start a new one, I think.